April 18, 1943, over the dense green canopy of Bougainville Island. The Pacific air hung heavy and bright beneath the morning haze. A formation of Japanese bombers droned low across the sea, their engines humming in calm rhythm. Their mission routine inside one of them sat Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The man who had once promised to dictate peace terms in the White House. He believed this flight was safe, his route, his time of departure, his escort all chosen with precision. No American aircraft were supposed to be anywhere near these skies then. From the far horizon came a whisper of thunder, silver shapes closing fast, twin engines flashing sunlight. Long noses, lethal grace P-38 Lightnings. Racing low over the waves, silent hunters guided by invisible intelligence. Within minutes, calm skies would turn into fire, and the man who had orchestrated Pearl Harbor would meet a fate, shaped not by chance but by the unseen reach of American codebreakers. The story begins long before that morning over Bougainville. In the years before that fateful April morning, Isoroku Yamamoto had become one of the most formidable minds in modern naval warfare, calm, calculating, and fluent in both the art of diplomacy and destruction. He stood as Japan's most respected naval strategist, a graduate of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, and later a student at Harvard University. Yamamoto understood America better than most of his peers. He had seen its industrial strength firsthand, the endless railways, the sprawling factories, the untapped potential of a nation that had yet to awaken to total war. That understanding filled him not with arrogance, but with dread. Yamamoto once warned Japan's leaders that a war against the United States would be a gamble it could not sustain. Yet, bound by duty and loyalty to the emperor, he became the architect of the very strike that ignited the Pacific War. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, for Japan. It was meant to be a swift and decisive blow, crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet before it could respond, and for a time, it worked. The world watched in shock as battleships lay burning in the shallow waters of Oahu. Yamamoto's plan had achieved stunning tactical success, but he knew what it had unleashed. "I fear," he was quoted to have said, "that all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." That resolve began to materialize quickly within months. The United States mobilized on an unprecedented scale. New carriers rolled off assembly lines. Pilots trained in droves. Industrial power turned into firepower. The Pacific, once dominated by the Imperial Japanese Navy, began to shift by 1942. The first cracks appeared in Japan's early dominance. The Doolittle raid, though militarily minor, struck Tokyo itself, a psychological wound that enraged the Japanese high command and embarrassed its leadership. Yamamoto responded with the bold gamble at Midway, hoping to lure and destroy the American carriers instead. His fleet suffered one of the most catastrophic defeats in naval history. 4 Japanese carriers were sunk, thousands of sailors lost, and the momentum of the war began to tilt toward the Allies despite the setback. Yamamoto remained a symbol of Japan's discipline and spirit. He traveled constantly across the Pacific, inspecting airfields, rallying troops, and maintaining morale to the men who met him. He was both distant and deeply human, polite, disciplined. A man who inspired loyalty not through fear but through quiet confidence. Yet even as he continued to project control, the world he had helped build was beginning to crumble beneath him. By early 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy was stretched thin. The long and bitter struggle for Guadalcanal had drained both manpower and morale. Supply lines grew fragile. Fuel reserves dwindled, and air superiority, once Japan's greatest strength, was fading fast. The Americans had learned, adapted, and were striking back with precision and power in Tokyo. Doubts began to whisper among the military elite. Yamamoto's strategies, once flawless, were now questioned. Some officers accused him of underestimating American resilience. Others still revered him, believing his leadership was the only thing holding the fleet together to counter the growing despair. Yamamoto decided to visit the front lines, himself to personally inspect bases in the Solomon Islands and encourage the men fighting there. It was to be a morale tour, a brief visit that would remind Japan's weary pilots and sailors that their commander still stood beside them. It was also, unknowingly, a decision that would cost him his life, for in a hidden room thousands of miles away, American codebreakers were already listening by the spring of 1943. The Pacific War had entered a new and complex phase one, no longer decided by surface fleets alone, but by information, code, and air power. Japan's ANSA seamless communication network had become its vulnerability across the Pacific. Allied cryptanalysts had been intercepting and studying Japanese naval messages for over a year. Breakthrough had come through an American intelligence program known simply as MAGIC, based in Pearl Harbor and Washington, D.C. Teams of linguists and mathematicians worked tirelessly to crack the Japanese naval code known as JN-25. It was an intricate cipher used by the Imperial Navy to coordinate its vast fleet, and decrypting it required equal parts genius and persistence. By mid-1942, those efforts had paid off. The intelligence gleaned from JN-25 had played a decisive role in the Battle of Midway, allowing Admiral Chester Nimitz to position American forces perfectly for an ambush. What few outside the intelligence community knew was that these decrypts continued to flow. Day after day, message after message, a river of secrets that revealed not only Japan's orders, but its intentions among the fragments of intercepted traffic. In April 1943 was a message unlike any other. It contained the itinerary of a high-ranking Japanese officer's inspection tour across several bases in the Solomon Islands. The message listed times, coordinates, and flight paths with meticulous detail to the analysts poring over it. One name stood out immediately: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The message was authentic. It detailed Yamamoto's plan to fly from Rabaul to Bailele, near Bougainville, to meet with local commanders and troops. It even included his departure time, 6 a.m. Tokyo time, and the expected arrival at 8 a.m. It was, in essence, a schedule for his own assassination, broadcast in code that America had already mastered. When this information reached the desk of Admiral Nimitz and the U.S. Pacific Fleet staff, the implications were staggering. The man who had conceived Pearl Harbor, the architect of Japan's war, was offering himself as a target, but striking him would raise a profound question. Could they act on intelligence that might expose the fact that Japan's codes were broken? President Franklin D. Roosevelt reportedly gave the answer in just a few words: get Yamamoto. The task fell to the U.S. Army Air Forces in the South Pacific. Planning the mission required unprecedented precision. Yamamoto's flight would cover roughly 400 miles of airspace over Japan-sealed territory, a corridor heavily patrolled and beyond the normal operational range of most American fighters. Only one aircraft could manage it: the Lockheed P-38 Lightning with its twin engines, long range and heavy armament. The P-38 could reach the target, strike fast, and return. The mission, codenamed Operation Vengeance, would be as daring as it was delicate. Every detail had to be synchronized: the timing of the intercept, the altitude, even the angle of approach. If the Americans arrived too early, they risked detection too late, and Yamamoto would have already landed. The pilots would have to fly nearly 600 miles at wave-top height to avoid radar, guided only by stopwatch and compass back in Rabaul. Yamamoto's staff prepared for the routine flight. They had no reason to suspect danger. Japanese forces still believed their communications were secure. The admiral, known for his punctuality, insisted on departing exactly as scheduled to him. Precision was discipline to the Americans. It would be the key to his destruction as dawn approached on April 18, 1943. 16 P-38 Lightnings lifted off from Guadalcanal. Engines roaring through the humid air, their formation curved east. Low and silent over the Pacific, navigating an invisible path plotted from decrypted code. They were hunting a man whose every move had already been read by minds he would never meet. In rooms he would never see ahead of them, somewhere beyond the horizon. Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft was already in the air. Unaware that the enemy knew exactly where he was and when he would arrive, the stage was set for one of the most remarkable interceptions in aviation history. Isoroku Yamamoto was not a man easily understood by either friend or foe to the West. He was the architect of Pearl Harbor, the symbol of Japan's aggression. To many within Japan, he was the reluctant warrior. A man who had once opposed the war he would later be forced to lead. Born in 1884 in Nagaoka, a samurai-descended family of modest means, Yamamoto's early career reflected Japan's transformation into a modern naval power. His studies at Harvard and his later post as naval attaché in Washington left a lasting impression on him. He admired American innovation and industry, but he also understood its latent strength. When Japan began to drift toward conflict, he warned that a short war was the only chance of victory. In the first 6 months to a year of war with the United States and Britain, he reportedly said, "I will run wild." But I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year. That honesty made him both respected and controversial within Japan's militarist circles. He represented a professional navy bound by honor, but not blind to reality. His leadership combined strict discipline with quiet empathy. He wrote personal letters to fallen pilots' families, and he traveled tirelessly to raise morale to his men. He was the embodiment of duty to his enemies. He was the mastermind who had awakened America's vengeance, that duality, duty and foresight. Respect and resolve defined Yamamoto's fate. His death would be mourned even by some of those who had brought it about, for they knew he had seen the tragedy long before it came. Operation Vengeance was not merely an assassination. It was a test of precision warfare. The WWII mission planners at Guadalcanal faced a puzzle of impossible geometry. Yamamoto's flight path stretched across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, well beyond the reach of most Allied fighters. To intercept him, the Americans would need to calculate time and distance down to the minute. Major John W. Mitchell, the commanding officer of the 339th Fighter Squadron, was tasked with leading the mission. With no radar guidance, his pilots would rely solely on compass bearings, airspeed, and fuel calculations. They plotted the intercept using a single sheet of paper, aligning every variable: takeoff time, speed, expected drift, and the exact moment Yamamoto's plane would cross their path. Each of the 16 P-38 Lightnings carried drop tanks for extra range. The route demanded a 600-mile journey, each way an enormous gamble. If even a single tank failed, the formation would fly at just 50 feet above the ocean, invisible to Japanese radar, their engines echoing against the waves. For nearly 2 hours they would be ghosts, unseen and unheard at the predicted point. They would climb and strike to reach Yamamoto's aircraft at the precise moment. Required perfect timing. The intercept window was measured in seconds. Too soon, and they would miss him. Entirely too late, and they would meet his escort hidden, outnumbered and exposed. It was a mission where mathematics replaced chance, where every pilot understood that failure meant not just death, but the loss of a once-in-a-generation opportunity. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was unlike any other fighter in the sky. With its twin booms, central nacelle, and long wings, it looked more like a bird of prey than an airplane. But beneath its unusual shape lay the innovation that made Operation Vengeance possible: range, speed, and reliability. Each P-38 was powered by 2 Allison V1710 engines, giving it the endurance to fly more than 1,000 miles, double that of most single-engine fighters of the era. It carried 4 50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon in those, concentrating firepower in a single devastating line of aim. The aircraft's design allowed it to operate at both high altitude and sea skimming levels. It could cruise low to the water, conserving fuel, then climb with lethal speed to Japanese pilots used to the agility of the Zero. The P-38 was an entirely different predator built not for dogfighting finesse, but for the kill for Operation Vengeance. The Lightning's characteristics became the perfect blend of engineering and intent. It could reach Yamamoto's aircraft, outlast the escort's range, and deliver enough firepower to ensure the strike was final. The mission would demonstrate not only American intelligence, but also its industrial might, the ability to design, build, and field a weapon that could carry war to any corner of the Pacific End. As the P-38s roared low over the open ocean that morning, their engines carried more than metal. They carried the weight of retribution. The hunters were closing in, guided not by luck, but by science, calculation, and vengeance written in code. When the decrypted message revealing Yamamoto's flight plan reached American command, it ignited debate that went far beyond tactics. Killing an enemy officer was one thing, targeting the highest-ranking commander of a nation's fleet was another. It was a decision steeped in both strategy and morality, a question of warfare's limits. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and the intelligence chiefs weighed the consequences. Using the information meant risking the exposure of MAGIC, the code-breaking operation that had given the Allies an unseen advantage. If Japan suspected its codes were compromised, they could change them overnight, erasing a priceless edge. Yet the opportunity was unparalleled. Yamamoto was not only a symbol, but also a strategist whose loss could ripple through every level of Japanese command. President Franklin D. Roosevelt made the choice swiftly. His message was concise, his intent unmistakable. Yamamoto's removal would weaken Japan's spirit and command structure at a critical juncture. It would also serve as a message that the United States could strike anywhere, even at the heart of the enemy's confidence. For the pilots assigned to the mission, this moral weight was palpable. They were not merely attacking a fleet or an airfield, they were executing a man. Yet in war, morality often dissolves into necessity. Yamamoto had orchestrated Pearl Harbor, planned operations that killed thousands. The decision now came full circle. America's terrible resolve, once spoken of by Yamamoto himself, would find its form in the crosshairs of a P-38. The ethics of targeted killing would echo long after the war. But in that moment, it was seen not as assassination, but as justice delivered from the air to the Japanese Navy. Yamamoto's inspection tour symbolized stability in a time of uncertainty. His presence among the forward bases inspired confidence that the Empire's senior command still believed in victory. At Rabaul, where his journey began, the airmen lined the runway, saluting as his twin-engine Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber took off into the dawn in the second escort bomber and the 6 Zero fighters that accompanied him. The atmosphere was formal, almost ceremonial. Yamamoto's aide-de-camp reviewed reports, and the Admiral himself sat quietly, reading. He was a man of ritual, always punctual, always composed. His pilots admired his steadiness, unaware that the precision he demanded would seal his fate for Japan's military. The concept of operational security was rooted in confidence. Their ciphers were complex, their logistics well managed, their aircraft reliable. The possibility that the Americans could know Yamamoto's exact flight plan never entered their minds. Even when the escort sighted distant glints of sunlight reflections off American wings, they assumed it to be coincidence. Realization that they had been found, tracked, and hunted down would come too. Late Yamamoto's death would later be seen as both a tragedy and a revelation. It shattered the illusion that distance and secrecy could protect even the most revered leaders. In the days that followed, the Japanese command would learn that the enemy's Reach was no longer measured in miles, but in information operation vengeance. Represented more than vengeance itself, it was the purest example of the new warfare taking shape where intelligence was as decisive as guns or bombs. The entire mission had begun not in the cockpit, but in silence, the hum of radio receivers, the scratch of pencils transcribing coded traffic, the click of typewriters deciphering secrets one digit at a time for the cryptanalysts of Station HYPO in Hawaii and the Navy's Fleet Radio Unit in Melbourne. This was their unseen battlefield. Their success had already turned the tide at Midway. But Yamamoto's itinerary revealed a new power, the ability not only to predict the enemy's moves, but to preempt them completely. This was war by information, war waged in whispers and calculations, and it signaled the dawn of modern intelligence, the principle that no secret, however carefully guarded, remained invulnerable from that day forward. Japan's confidence in its own communications would erode. The Americans would continue to read their codes, track their convoys, and anticipate their strategies. The war would still rage for 2 more brutal years. But the balance had shifted permanently, and the death of Yamamoto became both symbol and proof of that shift. Silent war of intelligence had claimed its most significant victory yet, and as Yamamoto's aircraft crossed over the Pacific that morning, those invisible forces, calculation, precision, and vengeance were already converging upon him. Ahead lay the moment when planning would become action, when the hunters would finally see their prey. April 18, 1943, Bougainville, Solomon Islands, 7:20 hours. The tropical morning shimmered with deceptive calm over the expanse of blue-green Pacific. 18 American P-38 Lightnings flew low, so low that their propeller tips nearly brushed the ocean's surface. Their engines hummed in synchronized rhythm, a metallic heartbeat beneath the roar of the sea wind. Each pilot knew this was no ordinary mission. This was Operation Vengeance, a one-way flight into Japanese-controlled airspace, aimed at a single man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy. They flew in radio silence, 10 miles apart, hugging the curvature of the Earth to evade Japanese radar. The formation stretched thin over hundreds of miles, a thread of determination and vengeance woven through the Pacific sky. The plan was precise, almost impossible. American cryptanalysts had broken Japan's naval codes from those encrypted transmissions. They had learned Yamamoto's exact itinerary, flight paths, departure times, even the number of escorts he would be flying from Rabaul to Bali Island. The Americans had only one chance, a 600-mile gamble through hostile skies at Henderson Field. The pilots had been briefed at dawn. Major John Mitchell led the squadron. Captain Thomas Lanphier Jr. and Lieutenant Rex Barber were chosen to strike the target. Each man memorized every detail of Yamamoto's scheduled departure at 6 a.m. Arrival expected at 8 o'clock. Their interception point was over Bougainville, 400 miles west. The timing had to be perfect. A difference of even 5 minutes could mean failure. Too early, and they'd be circling vulnerable. Too late, and Yamamoto would already be gone. They flew with extra fuel tanks strapped beneath their wings, knowing they'd need every drop to return, but none of them expected to come back. The P-38 Lightning was their only choice, the only fighter with the range for the mission. Fast, twin-engined, heavy with firepower. Each one carried 50 caliber Browning machine guns and a 20mm cannon, capable of ripping through aircraft armor in seconds. Mitchell's voice cracked over the radio once. Just a whisper. Check in, no chatter after this. A brief series of clicks followed. Acknowledgement without words, then silence again as they neared Bougainville. The jungle came into view, a vast green maze broken by smoke plumes from distant volcanoes. The Americans descended even lower, mere meters above the waves, eyes straining against the horizon. Then, at 7:35 a.m., they spotted it, 2 Betty bombers, silver fuselages glinting in the sun. Escorted by 6 Zeros flying protective circles above in one of those bombers, sat Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. The man who had once warned his government that Japan could only dominate for 6 months before America's industry overwhelmed them. He was punctual, disciplined, and predictable. His obsession with order had sealed his fate. Mitchell signaled to break formation. The interceptors climbed sharply, throttles wide open. The sudden roar startling birds from the trees below Lanfear banked right. Cutting off the escorting Zeros, Barber dove straight toward the lead bomber. Guns ready, the Japanese pilots, caught off guard, hesitated for a split second. It was enough. Barber's tracers sliced through the sky short. Lethal bursts of light. Bullets tore into the first Betty's right engine. Smoke erupted instantly. The bomber lurched, its wings sheared by fire. Inside, Yamamoto's staff shouted, unbuckled. Tried to react, but the P-38's attack came too fast. The Betty began to roll flames, spread along its fuselage as one of its propellers broke free. Barber pulled up, narrowly missing debris that whirled through the air. Lanfear, looping back, found himself facetto-face with a Japanese Zero. He squeezed the trigger. 2 bursts. The Zero disintegrated mid-turn. Another dived toward him. But Mitchell's wingman, Besby Holmes, intercepted with deadly precision. The sky erupted into chaos, a storm of gunfire, smoke, and trails of burning oil. But the second Betty, Yamamoto's, was still flying, descending erratically toward the treetops. Barber turned again, chasing it through a downward spiral. He aimed one final burst short. Deliberate, the rounds tore into the bomber's cockpit. Witnesses on the ground later reported seeing the aircraft glide for a few seconds, then dip its nose and vanish into the jungle canopy. A column of black smoke rose, curling above the trees like a signal of fate fulfilled. For a moment, the American pilots circled, scanning for more enemy fighters. None came. The escorts were scattered, broken at 8:01 a.m. Mitchell called the retreat. Fuel gauges were dangerously low. The mission had lasted less than 5 minutes of combat, yet it had changed the war's course. As was, they turned back toward Guadalcanal. The Pacific stretched endlessly before them. Silent once again, each man stared ahead, the adrenaline slowly fading, replaced by a heavy awareness of what they had done. They had just shot down Japan's greatest admiral, the man responsible for Pearl Harbor, and perhaps the only strategist who had understood how impossible Japan's war truly was. And far below, in the dense jungles of Bougainville, the wreckage still burned. Japanese soldiers would soon arrive to find the body of Isoroku Yamamoto slumped in his seat, his white gloves still immaculate, his katana resting beside him. The hunter of Pearl Harbor had met his end, not at sea commanding fleets, but in the sky, ambushed by the very intelligence war he had underestimated. Yet this was only half the story, because the true turning point wasn't just in the jungle. It was in the silence that followed, in Tokyo's stunned reaction, and in Washington's decision to never reveal how they knew. The jungle was quiet again. Only the echo of distant gunfire and the crackle of burning wreckage disturbed the tropical air. By noon, Japanese search parties began to move through the dense vegetation near Moila Point. The air was heavy with the smell of fuel and charred metal. They followed the column of black smoke until they found it the remains of a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, shattered among the trees. The wings had snapped upon impact. The fuselage was broken open like a tin shell inside. 7 bodies lay scattered, one of them seated upright, head bowed slightly forward. A katana still strapped to his side was instantly recognizable. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He had been struck by a single .50 caliber round to the lower jaw and neck. Death was almost instantaneous. His gloved hands still rested on his lap, unburned, untouched by the flames that consumed the rest of the plane. A medic recorded the scene with reverence, writing later, "He died as he lived in service to his emperor." Facing forward, the Japanese command was paralyzed for hours. They debated what to do, whether to announce his death or conceal it to avoid panic. Yamamoto had been more than an admiral. He was the soul of the Imperial Navy, a national icon, the man who had dared to challenge the United States and brought Japan its greatest early victories. When the news finally reached Tokyo, it struck like a thunderclap. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo reportedly sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the telegram. Emperor Hirohito's face, according to aides, turned pale. They ordered absolute secrecy for 1 full month. Yamamoto's death was hidden from the Japanese people. Even his closest officers were told he was on an inspection tour. The loss was simply too immense to comprehend. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, in an intelligence office in Pearl Harbor, American codebreakers stared at the decrypted transmissions that had confirmed his itinerary. They had succeeded, but at a cost that could not be spoken of, because if the Japanese ever realized that their codes had been broken, the advantage America gained from Midway and beyond could vanish overnight. So Washington ordered silence. President Roosevelt himself approved the mission, but insisted no public credit, no intelligence leaks. The official story released to the press would simply state that Yamamoto had been shot down by American patrols operating in the area. The pilots were forbidden to speak for years. Their mission would remain classified, even within their own ranks. Controversy brewed. Captain Thomas Lanphier claimed the kill. Lieutenant Rex Barber insisted it was his. Both would argue for decades, each believing he was the one who fired the fatal burst. But the truth was less about glory and more about consequence, because in that brief encounter over Bougainville, Japan's strategic direction changed forever. Yamamoto had been the empire's master planner, the rare officer who understood both the West's industrial might and Japan's limitations. He had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and had seen America's capacity for war firsthand. He had warned his superiors before Pearl Harbor, "I shall run wild for 6 months. After that, I can guarantee nothing." He had been right. 6 months after Pearl Harbor came Midway and Japan's first catastrophic defeat. Now, less than a year later, Yamamoto was gone. His death struck a blow far beyond the battlefield. It shattered morale within the Imperial Navy, leaving behind commanders who lacked his strategic foresight and restraint. Without him, the Japanese military increasingly turned toward desperation, suicidal tactics, kamikaze doctrines, and futile last stands that drained their remaining strength in the skies over the Pacific. His absence was immediately felt. The U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces intensified their offensives. Now confident that Japan's coordination would falter, the Solomon Islands campaign accelerated. Guadalcanal was secure. The tide had turned completely, yet, for all its success, Operation Vengeance was haunted by its own irony. The man who had orchestrated the most infamous surprise attack in American history had himself fallen victim to one planned with the same precision and deception he once prided himself on in a single mission. The balance of vengeance was complete, but among those who carried it out, victory was not celebrated. It was felt. A quiet, heavy realization settled over the men of the 339th Fighter Squadron. They had avenged Pearl Harbor, but they had also killed a man who, perhaps more than anyone else in Japan, had understood that the war was unwinnable. Yamamoto's body was recovered and transported to Rabaul, then to Tokyo. His cremation was attended by high-ranking officers in full-dress uniform on May 5, 1943. Japan finally announced his death to the public. The empire mourned as if for a fallen emperor. Radio Tokyo declared, "The combined forces of heaven and earth have taken from us our brilliant leader." Civilians wept in the streets. Newspapers printed his portrait bordered in black. Thousands of sailors lined the decks of battleships to salute as his ashes were carried past. But beneath the ceremony lay quiet despair. The nation that had once roared with confidence after Pearl Harbor now faced an unspoken truth. Their war, once led by Yamamoto's vision, was adrift across the ocean. In a small airfield in Guadalcanal, The American pilots who had changed history were debriefed in silence. There were no medals, no parades, no photographs, only a classified report that concluded with 2 words. Mission accomplished. The roar of their P-38s had faded into history, but its echo would continue across the Pacific because Yamamoto's death did not just end a life, it ended Japan's belief in invincibility, and from that moment on, the empire's long descent had begun. But what came next would show just how deep the shock ran across Japan's command, among its soldiers, and even within its own propaganda machine. The shock of Yamamoto's death echoed far beyond Tokyo, across every island, every garrison, every ship flying the rising sun. The news spread with a single word whispered in disbelief: Yamamoto. Dead? In the Pacific jungles and on the decks of battleships. Morale collapsed for the men of the Imperial Navy. Yamamoto had been more than a leader. He was a symbol of precision, honor, and control. To many sailors, he was the Navy. His death was not just the loss of a commander. It was the end of an era. Letters intercepted later by Allied intelligence revealed a deep sadness in the ranks. One officer wrote home, "The ocean feels empty now without him. We are ships with no compass." Even Japan's propaganda machine struggled to spin the loss for years. Yamamoto's charisma had been used to inspire national unity, his face printed on posters, his words broadcast in fiery speeches. Now, state media walked a fragile line. They glorified his sacrifice while quietly fearing its implications. The Imperial Army, however, was less sentimental. Rivalries between the Army and Navy had long simmered beneath Japan's war effort. Some generals saw Yamamoto's death as proof of naval weakness, an omen that Japan's maritime dominance was fading. The internal division widened, splitting Japan's military leadership at a time when unity was needed most. While Tokyo mourned, American strategists moved quickly to capitalize on the psychological blow. The U.S. Navy intensified its island-hopping campaign, striking the Central Solomons and New Guinea with renewed confidence. Without Yamamoto's coordinating influence, Japan's defensive plans faltered. By mid-1943. American bombers and carriers had pushed deep into the Pacific bases once thought impregnable. Munda, Rabaul, Tarawa began to fall in rapid succession. Japanese communications became chaotic, their code systems strained and fragmented after the loss of key leadership. Admiral Koga, Yamamoto's successor, tried to maintain order, but fate was cruel. Less than a year later, in March 1944, his own plane would disappear in a typhoon near the Philippines. His body was never recovered. 2 commanders, both gone in less than 12 months, and with them, the last coherent strategy of Japan's Navy for the Allies. Operation Vengeance had proven something profound, that precision and intelligence could strike harder than sheer firepower. It was the ultimate demonstration of how code-breaking, invisible, patient, and silent could shape the outcome of battles long before a single shot was fired. Back in Washington, the architects of the Operation Intelligence Officers of the U.S. Navy's Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, FRUPAC, quietly received commendations. Their success reinforced the critical importance of signals intelligence, or SIGINT, which would later guide Allied victories from the Marianas to Okinawa in the years after the war. Historians and military analysts would call it one of the most precise assassinations in military history. Yet, it was more than vengeance. It was the triumph of information over illusion. Still, in the minds of the men who flew that mission, the memory remained conflicted. Rex Barber once admitted, years later, that he thought often about Yamamoto himself, the strategist who had understood the futility of the war he was fighting. He wasn't a monster, Barber said. He was a soldier doing his duty, same as us. That sentiment, rare in wartime, reflected the quiet respect many American pilots had for their fallen adversary, even in death. Yamamoto commanded reverence from those who defeated him today. At the crash site near Bougainville, The remnants of Yamamoto's Betty bomber still rest among the trees. A memorial stands nearby, maintained by both Japanese and locals, a silent testament to the man who led his nation into its boldest gamble and paid the ultimate price. Visitors who make the long trek through the jungle often describe an eerie stillness there. The air is heavy, the forest is alive with sound birds, wind, the hum of insects, but the wreck itself feels untouched by Timmy. A lone sign reads, "Here fell Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, April 18, 1943, for Japan." It was the day hope began to die for America. It was proof that no one, not even the architect of Pearl Harbor, was beyond reach. The Pacific War would rage on for 2 more brutal years. But after Bougainville, its outcome was never again in doubt. The empire had lost its guiding hand, and from that moment forward, Japan's fate was sealed, carried on the same winds that had once lifted its admiral into the sky in the long shadow of World War II. The death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stands as one of the most symbolic turning points in the Pacific. It was not merely the fall of a man, it was the moment an empire lost its balance. Yamamoto had always known the truth his nation refused to face. He had studied in America, admired its industrial genius, and understood that Japan's war was a wager against time and production, a storm that could never outlast the American tide. Yet, out of loyalty and duty, he led that war anyway, knowing how it would likely end when his plane fell into the jungle of Bougainville. It carried with it not only his body, but Japan's last great strategist, the final voice of realism amid an empire driven by pride. In death, Yamamoto became both a legend and a warning to his countrymen. He was immortalized as a hero of sacrifice. To historians, he became a symbol of tragic foresight, a commander who saw the cliff ahead, but was powerless to stop his nation from racing toward it. For the United States, Operation Vengeance was more than payback for Pearl Harbor. It was a quiet demonstration of the new warfare that would define the century. Precision guided not by brute force, but by intelligence, mathematics, and patience. It marked the dawn of an era where battles would be won long before the first bullet was fired in hidden rooms filled with radios, cryptographs, and men who listened. And for the pilots who carried out that mission, the memory endured not as triumph, but as gravity, the weight of having ended the life of a man who might have ended the war himself, had he lived long enough to argue against its futility. Today, in the silent forest of Bougainville, the wreckage remains: twisted metal, faded insignia, rusted fragments, all swallowed by vines and time. Yet when the wind passes through the leaves, it feels as if the Pacific still whispers his name, because history remembers its ironies, and in Yamamoto's fall lies the story of a nation that reached too far, a commander who understood too much, and a war that could never be won.